So, back in September of this year, when I first started this class, I had one big question, and that was, why did people believe things? Why do people believe things when they aren't true, even if they're told that they're false? How come they continue to believe those things? It didn't seem to make any sense to me. I just thought, what are they just? Are they just stupid, or what else is going on? So the problem with people believing fake things seems to have gotten really bad with the beginning of the internet because that's when all the fake information can be transmitted so quickly, right? The internet is great. It's a great equalizer, but unfortunately, it also equalizes information. So information that used to be vetted by traditional media and by journalists and editors is now vetted by things like Facebook. They're the new editors, right? The new gatekeepers. Um, so this breakdown of the media has also coincided with a rise in social media. And with the rise in social media, it turns out that's where most people are getting their news. Something like, what is it, 18% of the people who say the most common way they get their news is through social media. And 3% get it through print, which I don't have the information on that right now, but obviously the newspapers used to be a much bigger source. But with the advent of the internet, that started to decline. So what that's led to is a less educated, informed population, um, and especially those who use social media to get their news. Those people have lower political knowledge than most other groups. We're kind of using political knowledge in this presentation as a kind of stand-in for people being informed. But the principle um, it applies to things across the board as far as people believing fake things and where they read them. Some of the reasons that people believe things that aren't true are due to cognitive processes that occur in the brain. I'm going to cover some of those here. So, first impressions and repetition. First impressions, so when someone first encounters a headline or reads a story and absorbs it, it can make them believe it. It can be more difficult to then go backtrack and tell that person it wasn't true. This really depends on the intelligence level of the person who's consuming the news. But the first impressions can be sticky, as it were. You can get the idea of this when, say, for in a courtroom, someone has showed evidence that someone is guilty, but then later that evidence is shown not to be true. There's still a impression of kind of guilt that hangs around the person. So that can be hard to reverse. Um, Repetition is a kind of blunt but effective tool used by propagandists and even advertisers, which are kind of the same thing. And it works, which we found in the studies we did about Hitler and the Edward Bernays material. Um, One experiment with repetition, as far as truthfulness goes, is people were shown headlines and then asked to rate the truthfulness of those headlines. They were shown a long list of headlines, and then a week or so later, they were shown the same list. As time went on and people saw the same headlines, they were more apt to believe those headlines were true. When headlines were introduced in following weeks in the experiment that they hadn't seen before, the people gave those lower ratings of truthfulness than the ones that they'd already seen. So familiarity with a headline or a topic makes one believe it's true. So truthiness and the illusory truth effect. When people read a headline or a story and they're deciding if it's true or not, they're more apt to believe it if it feels true, if it feels familiar. We talked a little bit about that in the last slide. If they've seen something, a headline, and they see that same headline a week later, they've seen it already and it feels familiar, but they experience that familiarity as truth. That's called truthiness. You think in that instance that you're thinking, but you're really feeling. An example of this is confirmation bias. If it confirms something that you already think is true, it kind of feels good and cozy. So you believe it, not because you're thinking, but because you feel good and cozy. This is so strong, it's such a strong effect, a strong phenomenon that it can turn disbelief into belief and vice versa. It's what makes cults so effective. Once they start breaking people down, they can really tell them anything because it just starts to feel true because they're feeling now that they're part of this cult, they're feeling, you know, part of a society. And so really their brains become more malleable. So why are these cognitive processes that I was just describing, why do they occur? They occur because thinking is hard. Thinking is difficult, and taking shortcuts, the brain wants to take shortcuts because the act of thought is physically taxing. The brain accounts for 2% of our body weight and uses about 20% of the body's energy. So that's a lot of energy. And cognitive shortcuts make it less stressful on the brain to use energy. And so when to conserve energy, the brain takes shortcuts. When the brain processes a statement more quickly, it feels truer because the ease with which the brain can process it makes the statement feel comforting. So, in the example I was giving before about repetition, when you've heard something once or twice or three times, your brain doesn't have to spend as much energy on it by the third or fourth time you've heard it, right? You can just kind of skip around it, or listen to two or three words and then you know what sentences it is, and that processing gives the brain a break. And when it does that, it allows the brain to process it more quickly. And when the brain processes it more quickly, it feels truer. So the brain kind of sends a signal like, oh, this I'm familiar with this, so it's kind of true. You're interpreting that ease as truth. So if we look at a couple different examples here, when you say, if there's a phrase, a rhyming phrase, say the United States is overweight, that's more believable than the United States has an obesity problem because it rhymes, right? The phrase rhymes. The United States is overweight. And the rhyming allows your brain to process the statement more quickly, so it actually feels truer. Another example is using colored words. So, words that are colored nicely or presented nicely, even, feel truer than words that are scrawled illegibly. It's probably why we see really on propaganda websites. This happens a lot on some of the Russian websites. There's the infographics look really bold and clean, and we see that sometimes on Fox News as well because it's really convincing to see words and presentations that way. So again, repetition can be experienced as truth, and it kind of greases the wheels of the brain, resulting in faster comprehension time, which is experienced by the brain as an indicator of truth, even though it's actually false. Those cognitive processes I gave an example of are just a few of the reasons and a few of the examples of the reasons people believe what they do. There's a whole field of research, of cognitive research, that's really interesting and explains why people believe fake stuff. But the real backbone of it is that illusory truth effect and the way the brain processes information and takes shortcuts in order to conserve its own energy. Aside from that stuff, there are social reasons people believe things that aren't necessarily true. I just wanted to touch on a couple of those briefly. There's the idea of identity, and there's the idea of just holding false beliefs. Identity is more important to most people than specific issues. Identity is your where you are in your personal identity, and then also your shared identity with your peer group, which is more evolutionary, has more of an evolutionary background, and power to have someone believe something. Uh, so it helps a person to feel like they have some strength in numbers, and that's more important than to a lot of people than a belief in a particular issue. So they would prefer to believe something and have it be incorrect as long as it gives them a sense of community. And I think we see stuff like that in groups like QAnon, and even in cults as well. When we see people in cults, it's often people who don't have strong community ties or strong family ties. Another reason that people can believe things is that they're really just pretending to believe something so that they can keep another less acceptable belief without having to give it up. Uh, Kind of an example of this. So in 2016, a Pew Research study showed that 57% of Americans believed that crime was up from 2008, despite it having fallen. So there's a lot of reasons for why people would believe that it was up. There's disproportionate coverage of violence in local news outlets, and of course, there's the media echo chambers, and the politicians who have a vested interest in making people feel afraid or feel like you know, their their identity is at stake. But the racially charged narratives that are pushed by those politicians, the cultures that are more racist will be drawn to those narratives if they contain phrases like law and order or the immigrant invasion. They'll be drawn to believing things that headlines about immigrant invasions, even if they know those headlines aren't necessarily true or they aren't entirely convinced, because it will allow them to rally around skin color really as a problem. It's not listed as the first problem or explicit, but it really is the kind of the dog whistle. And so they can believe in that there's a huge overwhelming crime problem from immigrants, even though they don't necessarily believe it, because what they really hold true is racism. So there are some ways you can make sure that you don't fall prey to fake information. There are some habits you can develop, and there are some things for you to look out for, to keep an eye on, to make sure that what you're reading and what you're consuming is accurate, and that you're not giving into some of the propaganda techniques listed above. Most importantly, is you can resist cognitive hijacking. Cognitive hijacking is something politicians, advertisers, anyone who wants to gain influence over a group of people can take advantage of the processes that I described above, in order to occupy space in your brains, to try to make you believe something or to convince you of something, to make you follow a particular agenda. The idea of occupying space is detailed by Edward Bernays in the book Propaganda. It's pretty much the core principle of advertising as well, but can also be used and is used to manipulate people's beliefs politically. This is most obvious or most easily seen in Russia propaganda, and the right wing media ecosystem, where you have, Fox News, that, or Donald Trump even, just constantly on Twitter. The facts aren't so important as the fact that he's constantly in your head. He's constantly tweeting. He's constantly there, making himself known. And so just that presence alone starts to wear a person's brain down. So a third thing that you can look out for is the fire hose of falsehood. And what that is an approach of propaganda used by Russian propaganda to instill information into people's heads. And so it breaks them down and makes them more vulnerable to propaganda. So the information is high volume and multi-channel, which is something we talked a little bit about with Hitler and the loudspeakers. It comes at all different and from all different media types: podcast, TV, social media, comment section. It's kind of a war on all fronts. It also is rapid and repetitive. It's overwhelming. It doesn't have any commitment to objective reality. So there can be articles about the coronavirus that contradict each other. The point isn't so much that there's one consistent story, it's that you don't know what to believe. It becomes overwhelming. There's no actual consistency to this information. And so when information is repeated like this, it short circuits the cognitive immune system of the news consumer, which leaves them vulnerable to attack, basically, and it leaves them anxious and paranoid. And so a disoriented and exhausted brain is more vulnerable to receive more propaganda. And this creates kind of a feedback loop where you become just this helpless propaganda receptacle, which is kind of what happens to people who watch Fox News. So that's something to watch out for. The other thing is to ensure healthy media habits. So when you're reading something, stop and think about what you're reading. Don't try and process it really quickly because then your brain starts taking shortcuts. And so, in the same way that our bodies crave junk food, our brains want to process easy information. So, stick to news sources that you trust. And if you're not familiar with a topic, don't blow through it and try to accept the first version of it. First impressions are really powerful, but resist them as much as you can. First impressions were really helpful for us when we were, in the plains of Africa, running from saber-toothed tigers. We didn't have time then to be like, well, is this true news or is it fake news? Because you'd be dead. And so people who made really quick decisions were the ones who lived. And so there's an evolutionary benefit to a first impression and reacting quickly. But there isn't a benefit to doing that when it comes to news. Watch what you feel when you're reading. Manipulators tend to use anger and outrage so that they can bypass people's intellect. So if you feel yourself getting angry and outraged, take a step back and look at what you're reading objectively. Don't use news as entertainment, use it as news. Fox News, CNN, a lot of these channels, they want to get ratings and they want to entertain. And when you're being entertained, you're not thinking. The same goes for Twitter. When you're scrolling through Twitter, you're really doing it to pass the time and be entertained. Take some media literacy classes. That's always helpful. It will probably detail a lot of the stuff I'm talking about here. And I think most importantly, if you want to really stop being a consumer of fake news, then quit social media, um, which I myself am trying to do this week. I've gone cold turkey on Twitter, because if you were to design a system that could implement the things we talked about above, like the fire hose of falsehood and the repetition and reading things and believing them quickly because you're not processing them, that system would look exactly like Facebook or Twitter. So be really cautious in your participation of social media. And that's it. Thanks for watching.